We're 1 minute past the hour, so I'm not gonna waste any time. I'm really excited today to introduce Cara Lewis. She is the Deputy Director for the Center for Translational Research and Implementation Science at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute within the NIH. She has a PhD in clinical psychology with expertise in advancing pragmatic and rigorous measures and methods for implementation science and practice. I have learned a ton over the years about methods and measures from her, and I'm so excited that she's able to bestow her wisdom on us today. If you really can learn so much about methods and measures from Cara, so I will just pass it to her now, and we're gonna collect questions in the Slido that we'll put in the chat. So please, as burning questions come to you during the talk, pop them in there, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end. So Cara, take it away.
Okay. Hi, folks. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with you here today. And it was requested that I speak to what is Citrus up to? So that's how we refer to our Center for Translation Research and Implementation Science, and where might we be going? And so I put a handful of slides together along those lines, but I really see this time as being for you all. So I'm grateful that the Slido is up and running and that we'll have plenty of time for conversation. We really would love to hear about the exciting work that you're doing and how to stimulate more investigator-initiated research and learn from you all. So not sure how methods nerdy we'll get today, but you know me, I couldn't help but throw a few slides along those lines in there. The content of this talk is mine, not of the Department of Health and Human Services or NIH. Okay, so I thought a good starting place would be to share with you the 4 pillars and cross-cutting themes for our center. So Citrus, I'll say a little bit more about this shortly, but we turned 10 last year. And when Citrus was stood up as a center by design and not a division, it was done so to be the strategic focal point for our entire institute for implementation science, community engaged research, health and equities research, and global health research. And many of the grants in our portfolio really tap into one or more of those 4 pillars. And then a cross-cutting theme of ours is really to support research training, career development, and research capacity building. As I just mentioned, Citrus turned 10, and some of you might have been able to attend the 10th anniversary celebration, which was on the heels of the Academy Health D&I conference, or some of our 10-year anniversary webinars. If you didn't get a chance to participate in those, I think they're archived online as part of the Hero Lecture series. But it really was a time of celebration of several grants and activities that Citrus has been able to support, but also reflection on where we're going. And that's where I'll spend most of the time today. But before looking ahead, we did really systematically look back. So what this slide shows you on the left is a portfolio analysis from the last 10 years across NIH of implementation science investments. And what is heartening to see is that there has been a 5-fold increase in implementation science competing awards over the last 10 years. This goes up to 2022, but the trend holds in 2023. We haven't yet looked at 2024. NHLBI is the 3rd largest institute and holds 13% of all NIH implementation science awards, and we're 4th overall for total costs. And you can guess who is in the lead: NCI, NIMH, and NIDA. And what's on the right-hand side of your screen is maybe a little less heartening, but maybe very motivating. This shows you that despite the 4-fold increase we see in NHLBI's investment in implementation science, it really continues to reflect only about 2-3% of our total investment. So if you're all here because you care deeply about implementation science, because you see it as bringing acceleration of discovery to impact, you might hope that this percentage grows. And so this is in part why I'm here to hear from you and point you toward the various funding opportunities we have on the street and areas we might grow in. Just a little bit more on the implementation science portfolio analysis data front that you might be interested in is just how our investments break down over career stage. So we looked at early stage investigators, new investigators, those who are established and those who are at risk. And the figure speaks for itself. I think we have a pretty good portion of folks who are earlier in their career who are getting implementation science awards. But there's more that we can do. And part of how we do that is through training. And so you see on the right-hand side in this pie-like graph that a large chunk of the implementation science awards are in the training space. And then the similar amount in the RPG space. And then we've got our cooperative agreements that have been really a huge chunk of our investment to date. So moving on then, what I thought I would do is spend a little time in each of our pillars. So that was giving you a glimpse at our investment over the last 10 years, not topic-wise beyond implementation science as a broad bucket, but implementation science I'll spend more time on later. This is giving you a glimpse at what we've invested in terms of community engaged research. So if you've heard of the Community Engaged Alliance or SEAL, this really came from congressional appropriations in the COVID pandemic, realizing that there were such disparities in vaccine uptake and a desire to engage communities to really address those disparities. And it's since grown well beyond the regional teams that were funded in the COVID pandemic to support a variety of other initiatives that are listed on the bottom. And now the 21 regional teams across the country are looking at testing interventions for structural and social determinants of health that are driving disparities in chronic disease, non-communicable diseases. So this is co-led by Citrus within NHLBI and the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. And so these SEAL teams constitute a platform. They bring meaningful community engaged research, leveraging the recent National Academies model into a variety of substantive areas. So we have the enrichment initiative, maternal health is a focus, climate health is a focus, but also bringing more community engaged research to other teams is a focus with these seeker consults. And I think I have a slide on that to show you. But before I do that, giving you a glimpse of some of the newer topics and areas that SEAL has taken on since the COVID pandemic has ended. So Seeker, if you're not familiar with, I did want to feature it because it is a resource that is available to you all. So if you're trying to do more community engaged research, if you're trying to up your inclusive participation in trials, for example, this is a consultative resource that the extramural community can access as a one-time case or in a more longitudinal fashion. And so there's an intake process that folks can basically submit their query to, and then Seeker constitutes a panel of experts to meet the needs. They work deeply with the Community Engaged Alliance for the initiatives that I just showed you. But again, this is a service that's available more broadly to folks. If you don't within your team have that type of expertise, this can help extend the reach of experts doing community engaged research. And the third pillar for Citrus is health inequities research or health equity research. And if you haven't tuned in to the Hero lecture series, I encourage you to do that. There are these quarterly events that are available through videocast. And last year we had a Hero event, so it was the intersection of health equity research and each of our other pillars. The topics for this year are forthcoming, so you can check that out online if you're interested to learn with Citrus and NHLBI in the health equity space. This is an interesting group that I thought worth mentioning. So this was one of the early citrus RFAs that was a cooperative agreement. I'm mentioning it because it is an investment that reflects community engaged research, health equity research, and implementation science. It could even be that some of you on the call participate in this Decipher Alliance. But I mention it in part because this is where you'll get a little bit of a glimpse of the methods part that was brought up earlier. Before doing that, I just thought it would be interesting to share what the seven teams are working on in the Decipher Alliance that are brought together with a research coordinating center. So you can see they're trying to implement a range of evidence-based interventions, but they are all type 2 or type 3 effectiveness implementation trials, and they're testing a range of implementation strategies. And if you glimpse at this implementation strategy column, you'll quickly see that they are multifaceted strategies by design, and that brings some really interesting methods questions to bear. If you'd like to read more about Decipher, there was a special issue published in 2023, and so there's the title for you on the screen. But one of the things that Citrus has really invested in is the technical assistance, not just at the time of application to help folks navigate the various funding opportunities and NIH processes, but also particularly in cooperative agreements once folks are receiving funding. And the first focus of the technical assistance for Decipher was to try to strengthen the research designs, the analytic plans, and sample size approaches, as well as the hybrid study types. And so if you're contemplating how do you choose and optimize the different study types, you might check out that special collection that I just mentioned. And the paper that came out of the really robust, intense work around technical assistance that was offered. There's one paper that's listed on the screen that was like these lessons learned from the Decipher initiative, where their protocols looked quite different ultimately than their applications did. And I think there's a lot of good insights in there. But what I'll spend a few slides on today is the second round of TA that these teams got around implementation strategy, operationalization, adaptation, tracking, and reporting. So what we ended up doing was inviting the teams to really utilize their MOP, their Manual of Operating Procedures, to address these issues. What are the strategies that constitute your independent variable? Which might seem like an obvious exercise, but just to be clear, the purpose was to ensure that, as is intended for MOPS, that sufficient operationalization existed for new study team members to be able to monitor execution and confirm integrity, but also to ensure replication, spread, scale of successful strategies. I'm not sure if you read Annette Boetz, I always say her name wrong, but the review of reviews of implementation strategies published last year or in 2024, one of the big takeaways was that in these systematic reviews of implementation strategy effectiveness was insufficient detail to be able to replicate implementation strategies. And so Citrus is really sensitive to that. And so not just in our cooperative agreements like Decipher, which is the example I'm putting in front of you today, but also I think you'll see in more and more in our funding opportunities, requirements to be operationalizing, tracking, and reporting on implementation strategies so that if successful, others can pick up and spread those implementation strategies so that we can see replication, so that we can see within these systematic reviews sufficient detail for others to benefit from these investments. And so what did we do? We had the teams essentially, fill out sections of their MOP using prompts. And then we reviewed them as a federal team. And then we had these live TA sessions during their annual meeting. And here are some themes that we gleaned from across the 7 teams in these TA sessions. So if you're not familiar with these biphasic awards, they have basically a planning phase. And this was a 3-year planning phase for this particular alliance. And it appeared to be absolutely critical for their community engaged approach to implementation strategy design. And so that's a take home for us as funders to understand how critical that is for community engaged implementation science, to have that type of planning funded experience. Also of note was that the MOPS were comprehensive in the what, but the how was often missing. So some of these folks were testing tailor and adapt as a strategy. And they would give us, what in terms of, what and who would be at the table and what they would be trying to tailor, but not how those decisions would get made or how they would select a discrete strategy from a different discrete strategy. How would they be using data for informing their tailor and adapt process? So just a plug that the how is often underspecified. Another interesting observation was that community engaged tailoring strategies were often not captured. So all Decipher teams were tracking to some degree what strategy they were deploying and testing. But when community partners were enacting organic, you might say, or unplanned strategies, they weren't capturing these in their tracking. And so it makes it really hard if they are successful with their multifaceted approach to be able to stand that up in other environments if they're not able to report out on what that is. And then I said that teams were tracking to some degree. We definitely discovered that more pragmatic methods for tracking strategies need to be tested and available to folks. So lists is a very common approach to tracking implementation strategies, and there are even some nice platforms or a platform available to do that, and they're still highly cumbersome and require a lot of expert knowledge to be able to do it well. A few more reflections. I think that there's a lot of wisdom in being able to leverage this idea that as long as the function of an implementation strategy is retained, the form can change and we can still, call it that strategy, or we can still feel confident that we're testing the intended strategy. But we saw a really interesting example where the form changed and the function also changed because of how the form changed. So it really shone a light on the need to further test and elaborate this notion that it's okay if the form looks a little different or if the adaptable periphery is adjusted to fit the context. As long as the function is retained, I think more work needs to be done, and I'm happy if there's time to dig into a case example there. We still see, not just with Decipher, but with a lot of our implementation science investments, that the study team is leading the implementation strategy, not just designing it, but they're in the field doing it. They're the ones that are carrying out the implementation strategy. Or they're paying an expert implementer to do it and not always doing a cost analysis. And this feels a little bit worrisome, I think, to us that then how will that strategy be picked up and used by folks outside of a research context if there's no information about costing and you need expert skills to be able to do it, and you haven't even explicated what those expert skills are and if they could live in another person who's not an implementation scientist. So other things we're thinking about there. And then there were some instances where the teams didn't even see activities as strategies. And so that, again, makes it difficult for replication and scale and spread. And then some additional missed opportunities, lingering questions. So when we look to reporting guidelines like the Proctor-Powell-McMillan that was published in 2014, you see this one of the fields I think is named targets or action target, and we often saw those be listed as people. So the target is providers. But we're encouraging folks to think about conceptual targets. The targets are motivation. The targets are opportunity. The targets are climate or something like that, so that you're more precise on what the strategy is intended to do as opposed to who it's intended to act on. So that's a pretty nuanced methods thing, but something that will be interesting to see folks thinking about. It's not just within these alliances where by design they're meant to share and learn from each other, but we're trying to think too about how do other investigators, implementation scientists share and learn across their studies in real time, ideally. And then this curiosity of adaptation in that planning phase, is that one time and then ready to scale, or is local contextualization always a necessary pre-implementation step? So hopefully you all can answer those questions today. Next up, just featuring that we have kind of a sibling alliance. This one is based in Africa, though, and people living with HIV are participants, and we fondly call this the HLB Simple Alliance. If you're interested in learning more, you can visit that link, and we'll share these slides out after today. And I just thought I'd also acknowledge, we do take the training and career development opportunities seriously, and had a series of K-12 programs funded that are, some of them are just wrapping up now, that have had some really good impacts on building and supporting the careers of new implementation scientists. But we're looking, what are the next opportunities, really what's needed? So we're tackling an environmental scan of promising practices for building implementation science capacity, either those funded by NIH or those funded by the extramural community and their institutions in which they sit. So we're eagerly learning more about what's working and what are some of the spaces for more. So I'll breeze through these next couple slides to acknowledge that I've always appreciated this characterization that David Chambers offered when we did a plenary together at CIRC in 2017, that the first phase of implementation science sort of felt like, what got in the way? Why aren't our evidence-based practices getting picked up? And then the next decade was sort of like, what works? What implementation strategies exist? And you can see seminal articles at the bottom that kind of characterize that decade of implementation science. And I really hope that this is the decade of how and why, how does it work? And so really thinking about implementation mechanisms and the how and the processes through which these strategies exert their effects. So if you're interested in contributing to that line of inquiry, our team in September of last year published a research agenda to advance the study of implementation mechanisms. I think there are 150 discrete possibilities of work in this space. So there's something for everyone, and not a single research team can possibly do it all. But if you're interested in learning more and really pushing on the study of implementation mechanisms, I encourage you to check out that article. And in fact, there's a whole special collection that sits across implementation science and implementation science communications to advance the study of implementation mechanisms, and a couple other articles that are part of the special collection are on the screen there for you. And I like to remind folks, it's not just me and a small nerdy group who are interested in these types of issues. The editors at Implementation Science really flagged the import of studying mechanisms of processes in their recent editorial that was published in October 2024 as well, amongst other things, of course. So this is the part where I really encourage you to come find us. So I recall earlier in my career feeling like I didn't want to burden program officers. They must be very busy, and I didn't know when was the right time to reach out to them. And I'm here to say anytime, all the time, we're here to support you, to help you find your way. I hope you saw that the NIH-wide D&I program announcement was just renewed to reflect the simplified review criteria. The old PAR was set to expire in May. We expired it early so we could stand up this renewal. And so we have another many years of inviting you to submit your implementation science applications. NHLBI has signed on to the R01. And so if you're interested in exploring that clinical trial optional NOFO, I think I'm the point of contact for NHLBI. I'm happy to receive a super drafty one pager from you. It doesn't even have to be in the form of an Ames page, but just to get a sense of the general direction you're going. And my job is to triage your application to find an expert who can meet up with you one-on-one to identify whether or not your application seems responsive to this NOFO, and if not this NOFO, then which one might be a better fit, and to help you navigate all the steps along the way. And other things we're excited about and hope that you'll contribute to are a series of special collections that are open still. So these are not led by me, but are led by other colleagues. And they reflect areas of enthusiasm for not just the editors of these special collections, but also many of us at NIH. So you can see Gilanetta from NCI is organizing with Enola Proctor and Alex Ramsey this one on PACE, which was the theme of the Academy Health D&I conference last December. There's this really interesting one here around generalizing in context, and then this one around using most and optimization methods in implementation science. So hopefully exciting things to come there. One thing we're paying a lot of attention to are different hybrid types. So observational implementation hybrids are, I think, an underutilized approach. And so we're thinking about how do we get more out of cohort studies? So epidemiologists and implementation scientists working together to surface implementation relevant information as they are learning from people longitudinally about heart, lung, blood, and sleep conditions, which are the mission areas of NHLBI. And I think I will also acknowledge that we're, paying attention to being equity explicit when it comes to our implementation science applications and awards, with also acknowledging there's room to be, optimizing our theories, models, and frameworks to center health equity. There are definitely several that are available to us, but I think more work needs to be done there. Here are a host of workshops that Citrus has led recently, which is a signal to you about areas of enthusiasm. So there was one in 2023 around centering communities in dissemination research to promote health equity. And that has resulted in a NOC. So these are Notice of Special Interests, called Leveraging Existing and Accessible Data Sets for Implementation Research Strategies and Testing, Lead First. The objective there is to promote the use of existing local level data sets to inform community engaged dissemination implementation research on heart, lung, blood, sleep to advance health equity, and utilizing, this is the model that I was mentioning earlier. It's a conceptual model for assessing meaningful community engaged research. This past June, we hosted a workshop on art for health's sake. And so we were thinking about evidence-based interventions that are of the arts. We were thinking about arts as dissemination strategies and arts as implementation strategies. And there's a lot of energy across NIH to see where this conversation goes. So if you yourself are an artist across a variety of mediums or have artist colleagues, this is an understudied area. We found one study in our portfolio analysis that brought art and D&I together. We also hosted a workshop on optimizing oversight of implementation science clinical trials. So I'm sure you're the first to acknowledge that implementation science clinical trials look a little different than drug and device safety clinical trials. And so how do we right size the monitoring and oversight to learn what we can and support our human participants and uphold ethical principles. So there's more work to come from there. Also is an implementation research with direct-to-consumer telehealth workshop that was hosted just a few months ago. You can find workshop summaries on our website, I should say. And a NOCI came out of a related workshop to this one. So this is around assessing real-world effectiveness and implementation of telehealth-guided provider-to-provider communication among rural communities. If you're interested in tagging that NOCI, there's a QR code here for you. And then I think this is the last one that I'll feature today. There was in September of last year, Global Implementation Science Approaches to Improve Maternal Health, Maternal Heart, Lung, Blood, and Sleep Health Outcomes workshop that Citrus led. Forthcoming, your participation is welcomed. We'll be hosting a workshop this calendar year on moving beyond the basics, so identifying advanced training needs and opportunities in implementation science. Some of us are thinking about this as, implementation science, the 300 and 400 levels, and how do we support things like bringing system science and more economic analysis or mechanism testing into bringing more of those experts into the field. And then we've got one called the next generation of implementation strategy testing. My intent here is to overwhelm you with the incredible resources that the field has developed just even in the last decade. So these tools, these frameworks, these tracking methods, they're all related. And I think they all position us to be able to do better in terms of theorizing about implementation strategies, about tracking them, about reporting out on them. But we really need the experts to come together and think about, are they complementary? When do you use which approach? How can we guide and enable the extramural community to leverage these advancements to move beyond a menu of strategies, multifaceted strategies that are so very complex sometimes and hard to replicate. So that's a glimpse of what's to come this year. And I think I will add two more slides going back to this one. This is a secondary data analysis funding opportunity that we're signed onto that implementation scientists might want to take advantage of. It's the R21, and I think Citrus hasn't seen any come through. So just really wanting to put that in front of you. If you've got rich data sets, then I think there's a lot that could be relevant in response to this particular funding opportunity. And then just sharing a pipeline of the types of funding opportunities for career development. So there's a lot that folks can take advantage of as they're moving toward independent investigator funded research. So happy to go back to any of these slides in the Q&A portion. And I think this is my last one where I try to encourage you to come work with us. So I know I definitely didn't have the federal employment on my radar as a graduate student. This is not something that occurred to me until I was encouraged to think about this Citrus job. And now that I'm here, I do find it terribly exciting to be on this side of the fence, so to speak, helping to think about priorities and make them into funding opportunities and support the important work that you all are doing. So on that note, I hope that I've left sufficient time for dialogue and look forward to it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Cara. You covered so much there. Very exciting. And I really want to encourage folks to pop their questions into the Slido if you haven't already, and you want to take a look at them and upvote the questions you're most interested in hearing. I'm going to start off with a couple of them. Also, if you want to actually ask your question directly to Cara, put your name there so I can have you jump in. A lot of these are anonymous. But maybe we can start with, there's a couple of questions here about NHLBI and technical assistance and things like that. So maybe we can start there and then we can get more technical. So one question was around, um, do you have, can you expand a little bit more on like what the TA looks like when you get TA from a funding officer? And if people need to be submitting to NHLBI to actually reach out to you, like what does that look like? Do you have to go to a particular place? You talked about referrals. A little bit more about that would be great.
All good questions. So, okay, the starting place might be that you're often looking around at what the funding opportunities might be in terms of a program announcement, PAR, or a request for applications, RFA, and listed within those at the bottom is always the programmatic or scientific point of contact for each institute that is signed on to these. So when you're thinking about your application and you're looking around to see what funding opportunities there are, you're usually syncing up your target of your application with a specific institute, center, or office. And so within the name of NHLBI is Heart, Lung, Blood, and then also sleep. The National Sleep Center sits within NHLBI, and that's an NIH-wide resource. So if you are studying the heart, lung, blood, or sleep conditions, then NHLBI would be a good target for you. And then what you're doing is you're looking to see, you can go on our website, you can see a whole list of funding opportunities that you can just click through. Or you can say, I'm not sure which funding opportunity would be right for my application, and you can just reach out to me.
Mhm.
And if you have a drafty concept paper or Ames page, that allows me to identify a program officer who would take you through that TA process. And I try to match up their interests and expertise with the application focus that comes through. And then part of what they can do is actually help you navigate the various funding opportunities and say there are pros and cons to this one, or this one seems like the one you're most responsive to. Or they can even say, the more we've talked about this, the more it seems like NIDDK would be a good target for you,
Mhm.
because even though you have some emphasis on cardiovascular disease, you're really targeting more of the diabetes component that is living within the same humans that you're interested in helping. And so let me connect you with a colleague over at NIDDK. And it is often the case that implementation scientists are studying comorbidities. And so you might have the opportunity to look to a variety of institutes,
Mhm.
offices, and centers, which means you're in a really good position. And in those instances, you still need to choose a primary ICO, an institute, center, or office. So you might choose NHLBI as primary, but you might want to have conversations with program officers at NCI, for example, if you're working with a cancer, with folks who have cancer, and ask if they'd be willing, should this fare well in review, would they consider co-funding? And if you technically have both listed, then that is an opportunity and an option, and it isn't if it isn't listed
Mhm.
before you submit these things. What is technical assistance then like once you get connected with somebody who hopefully has expertise to support you? It can just be them sitting across from you answering your questions. And your questions can be along the lines of, can you help me assess if this is a clinical trial or not per the NIH 4-question definition? Should I, have so and so as key personnel? Do I look competitive as a principal investigator, or should I have MPIs? And the program officers aren't advising you. This is your application, but you're allowed to put those types of questions in front of them, and they can certainly opine or point you towards resources that might be helpful. And in some cases, they're actually helping investigators find other investigators that round out expertise that they, didn't realize they needed, but then through conversation did. I mentioned that TA also can help identify sort of best fit funding opportunity. But then your program officer is also going to, be your best advocate as your application makes it through peer review. They'll sit in on that session and take good notes, ideally. And then after you receive your summary statements, help you try to contextualize and make sense of what's written in those summary statements. And hear what your intended response to those reviews might be, and figure out if a resubmission is worth doing or a pivot is necessary, and really helping you navigate the NIH policy. I mean, I think that is such a complex space to make sense of, and that's what program officers are really, really good at. So I'm happy to answer more questions about TA, but I'll pause there because I've said a lot.
Super helpful. I feel like a lot of those tips are things that we gather along the way, and you just got them, give them to us in a nice little package. Taking us on a totally different point, the most upvoted question so far is, can you share more with folks about how people are thinking about arts as implementation or dissemination strategies? That was, I think, a new topic. I hadn't heard that before. So anything more you can share about that work?
Sure. So one thing that really bubbled up was social prescribing as an evidence-based intervention, and how to really do more to scale and spread of social prescribing as an art-based, evidence-based intervention. But then lots of other examples in totally different directions. There were almost like three buckets that were features of the conversation. One where the evidence-based intervention itself was arts-based. Then there was using arts as dissemination strategies. These might be the most obvious things to you, where it's like cartoons to, reach youth, to help them, see about and gain access to evidence-based interventions. And then the third bucket was more around implementation strategies and bringing various forms of art into the implementation space. So I'm trying to think off the top of my head. So one thing that happened in a youth residential setting where they were trying to bring cognitive behavioral therapy in was the youth engaged in poster contests for these monthly campaigns where they were essentially the focus of the intended intervention, and they were drawing pictures about the evidence-based intervention in their setting. So I don't know if that's satisfying, but it really was the start of a conversation. It was a 4-hour, pretty small workshop because it's a pretty small field, to be honest. There's an arts intensive 5-day curriculum going on in the UK. Daisy Fantoncourt, I think is her name, is the leader of that, where she's really taking attendees, trainees through from the evidence base for arts-based implementation science to, what's needed and everything in between, research designs and whatnot, because I think there's an interesting uphill battle here for scientific proposals in this area in terms of having, a dearth of measures, having trickier times from an evaluation standpoint, because you're often looking at really broad reach of certain types of these strategies. So I might leave it there for now, but there is, as I mentioned, an executive summary of that workshop online if folks are curious to learn more.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I know a recent doctoral student did this amazing art exhibit as I would call it a dissemination strategy of her dissertation, and that's what made me think of it. So
Cool.
really interesting to think about it in these different, as the intervention, as the implementation strategy, or dissemination strategy. I'm gonna pass it to Julie and have her ask her question because she put her name there. So Julie.
Sure. Thank you so much for this. I just wanted to ask a little bit more towards the end. You were probing a little bit on how implementation trials are different from other types of efficacy and effectiveness trials. And this, as someone who does a lot of hybrid trials, we struggle a lot with this in terms of oversight, with some of and see a lot of variation even across different NIH institutes and how they think about monitoring. And so I'm looking forward to reading the report, but I was really hoping you could talk a little bit about what maybe you like has been in the report so far, or some of your perspectives or thoughts on some of these types of issues.
Yes, this is a big conversation. So definitely do encourage you to read the report. I think I just saw the approval of the summary to go up on the website happen the hour before this call. So if you don't find it immediately, it's coming. And I should acknowledge too that there was a discussion forum at the Academy Health D&I conference to take what the workshop did was surface a lot of gaps or missed opportunities. And now we're trying to turn it into action. So action could be in the hands of the extramural community in some cases, but action could certainly be on the NIH side. And I'm not suggesting that we have the power to change NIH policy, at least overnight, but we certainly are reflecting very carefully on what Citrus brings to bear in terms of oversight. So we talked about everything from what some people refer to as unintended consequences and others refer to as ripple effects. And maybe I'll spend a moment on that to acknowledge that our severe adverse events and adverse events in implementation science are unlikely to be that which is typical in a drug and device safety trial. Fortunately, we are unlikely to have the same risk profile where patient mortality is front and center. But do we see burnout when adding more and more evidence-based practices and very complex implementation strategies in some of our trials? And are we tracking that? Have we seen that providers have stated in an electronic health record that they have obtained information about depression from their patient when they didn't ask those questions because it was mandated to be able to sign their note as part of our implementation strategy? These are interesting unintended consequences that implementation scientists really need to be thinking about. So that was one area. There was a lot of conversation about equity and should this be monitored in implementation science clinical trials? Is there exacerbation of disparities by the very nature of the evidence base for the evidence-based practice or the strategies that are being deployed and tested? Other things we talked about are maybe less interesting, but still critically important, like what are DSMBs paying attention to, and are they trained in implementation science to be able to provide the type of monitoring? And what about the resources that are necessary to be collecting data for hybrid type 2s? Some of the data that people are being asked to collect are such a burden on community partners, and what do we expect out of that? So, and that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we discussed as being opportunities for optimization. And we don't have necessarily the right actions for moving forward. This really needs experts like you to help inform next steps. So our next steps are to work with the panelists from that workshop on a series of papers that we hope will come out this calendar year, but papers don't necessarily mean action. It's just our vehicle for making sense of like, what should we do next? But happy to continue this conversation offline with folks who have energy to do so.
Thanks so much, Cara. That was really helpful. And where can people find that report when it's published?
So the NHLBI website has an events page.
Okay, great.
And all of the workshops are archived there with reports.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
We have time for a few more questions, about 10 minutes left. One person was wondering about, are there any funding opportunities available specifically for researchers in low and middle income countries in your space?
Yes. So there are, I'm just going through concrete examples in my head. So a lot of the funding opportunities that were signed on to allow foreign components or foreign investigators, and the D&I PAR is one good example of that. So there So global health research, definitely a priority for Citrus. And we want to support making sure that in-country foreign-based investigators are PIing these awards when it makes sense to do so. And in fact, we've been thinking, I should have mentioned this, but a lot about research administration and building capacity for research administration in low and middle income countries, but also in low resource settings domestically. We partner a lot with Fogarty International Center,
Mhm.
which does a lot in the training and career development. And so we hope to create a pipeline where those earlier career folks are finding their RPG awards through NHLBI. And we have a senior program director in global health named Dr. Makita Williams, who is really the strategy driver of our global health research. Folks are interested, reach out to me and I'll make a connection and help you find additional funding opportunities that are currently on the street.
Thanks, Cara. Another kind of funding related question is, are you seeing proposals related to generative AI or target trials? Those are two things somebody was interested in.
Yeah, so there is so much activity in this space,
Mhm.
and I'm trying to think of what's available to you now. Um, I, off the top of my head, don't have funding opportunities that I could name, but I'm happy to receive emails and point you in the right direction. NHLBI has been thinking in this space for quite some time, and we've just rounded out our team with strategic leadership in this front. So our former director of the Division of Cardiovascular Sciences has stepped into deputy role for precision health and artificial intelligence and no, precision health and data science, in which artificial intelligence falls. And that team is being built out to ensure that NHLBI is at the cutting edge of what's next. So we hosted, Citrus specifically hosted a think tank at our 10th anniversary celebration on the intersection of artificial intelligence and implementation science. And there will be a product out soon from that think tank to share some of the thinking that was emergent from that session.
Great. Thank you so much. Wonderful. I'm gonna take us back. I'm jumping around a lot using your brain to more implementation sciencey stuff. So in your talk, you asked, you were talking about the Decipher TA study, and how did you determine that form and function both change versus just form? Because I'm like a form and function. I have never like how do you know? How do you
Yeah.
tease that out in a study?
Well, I will admit that I've asked Brian Mittman to write more papers on this topic because I find the ones that exist are falling short. Not that they're insufficient, but there's more work to be done. I feel like I don't totally get it myself.
Okay.
And so with this, the one example that comes to mind that felt like an aha moment for me that really pushed the envelope on the form versus function was a team that um, was centering delivery of their evidence-based practice in faith-based organizations. And they were embedding nurse practitioners in their faith-based organizations. Um,
Mhm.
and the function was to increase access to the evidence-based interventions in settings that are familiar and comfortable to
Mhm.
people who deserve to benefit from the evidence-based intervention. And nobody would talk to the nurse practitioner.
Mhm.
They hired someone who appeared to reflect background and other characteristics of the population who would go to this organization, and they ultimately had to discontinue work with that nurse practitioner and found a local who attended that church,
Mhm.
happened to be a nurse practitioner who was open to taking on the role. And lo and behold, the form didn't change in that instance, but the function needed
Mhm.
because it was more about trust.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
wasn't just about access, it was also about trust.
Mm.
And I don't know if that resonates for others, but it was not exactly the example of the form changed and the function changed, but the form stayed
Mhm.
the same, but the function changed. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Great. Thank you for that example. Yeah, I agree. More people kind of trying to tease out those differences, I think would really help the field so much. So great. I'm gonna do one more. You guys have really been rolling in since we oh, you mentioned a few announcements around analyzing pre-existing data, and there's a few questions around that. Can you expand on what Citrus might be looking for in a submission like that?
Yes and no. I
Okay.
mean, there's always research examples in funding opportunities that reflect
Yep.
thinking of the folks who put that funding opportunity together. And if institutes sign on time, which NHLBI is notorious for not doing because our internal process is a little bit slow, then you get to put your institute specific research examples.
Got it.
And so I would always look to those because then
Okay.
you're speaking to the best thinking of the
Mhm.
folks who put that funding opportunity together. But by design, these are, intended to surface investigator initiated work. And so we think you all have your finger on the pulse of the science
Mhm.
as good as, if not better than we do.
Mhm.
And so if you don't see something in a research example that you were hoping to propose, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't propose it.
Mhm.
And so I think that's another place where technical assistance TA can be
Mhm.
helpful. But I don't want anyone to think that the research examples are circumscribed in terms of the universe of possibilities. And I don't frankly have any that are top of mind to share. We haven't seen any come
Mhm.
through. So
Okay, great. Thank you. That's super helpful to know, there is an openness, but those examples can also help guide us. Great.
mhm.
So I'm going to close us out. I want to thank you so much, Cara, for joining us. It's really wonderful to have your perspective and your leadership at NHLBI. So thank you for coming. And thank you all for staying and asking great questions. Just to let folks know, our February speaker will be Enola Proctor. She's from WashU in St. Louis. She's an emeritus there, and we're really lucky to have her. So two back-to-back star-studded January, February here. So hope to see everybody in February. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, folks.